morning. I'm Mindy Crawford, Executive Director of Preservation Pennsylvania. First off, I want to thank you for joining us here on Zoom. I do want to offer an apology and a bit of an explanation. We chose the platform Attendify so that you could all have a chance to interact with each other, and we felt fairly confident that you were going to be able to view the sessions there. Unfortunately, the system crashed yesterday, and although they assure us that it has been repaired, I would rather improve your conference experience by taking it to a platform that I feel comfortable with. And so thank you. I believe in belts and suspenders, and I'm really happy that we had the option to come to Zoom available to us. So all of the remaining sessions will be on Zoom today and tomorrow. I also want to just very quickly let you know that we added a fun activity today at 4 o'clock. We have a trivia contest with our beloved quizmaster, Brian Van Sweden. So join us on Zoom at 4 o'clock and you can win prizes. So let's get started. Thanks for joining us this morning. We are so pleased to have our panelists here this morning to share their recent work in archaeology. Archaeology is a field where I know only enough to get myself in trouble, but thankfully, since I met Joe Baker, he's taught me for a greater appreciation and doesn't laugh, well, not too loudly when I ask him crazy questions like, what's a lithic scatter? In the last 15 years, a number of archaeological projects have employed dendrochronology, historical document research, and old-fashioned excavation techniques to produce a changing picture of Pennsylvania's environmental history. Joe Baker is an archaeologist who retired twice, once from Penn and due to the pandemic from DCNR as well. Still, retirement for him doesn't mean leaving archaeology, and he is managing to get his fingers into a lot of interesting projects. I met Kate Peresolak as one of Joe's interns a few years ago. Now she has 8 years of professional archaeological experience, and I usually see her wearing a yellow safety vest and talking to me from the side of a highway. In 2017, she received a preservation award from Preservation Pennsylvania for her groundbreaking work at the Carroll Cabin in Fayette County. Before I turn this over to the speakers, I just want to remind you to type your questions into the chat box, either here or on Attendify, and at the end of the session, we will come back and ask those questions. Also a reminder that this session is being recorded and it will be available after the conference. So I'm going to mute and disappear and let you take it from here.
Thanks, Mindy. So I am hopeful that everyone can see this PowerPoint, and I am hopeful that you all can hear me. We're going to run through this presentation, and I must confess that we're going to actually read from a paper, which is something both Kate and I dislike, but it'll definitely help with the logistics of this, and I think we can be a little bit more freeform at the end when you guys have an opportunity to ask some questions. So without any further ado, I'm going to start this, and then I'm going to hand off to Kate, and then I'll be back at the end, and I'm going to have to do it without my glasses on, so people get to see what I look like without my glasses on, which is fine. All right, so there we go. Dendrochronology, or tree ring dating, has been a critical part of the archaeologist's toolkit since the first decade of the 20th century. The methodology employs sequences of tree growth rings, beginning with modern old growth specimens whose actual dates of germination and felling, if they have been felled, are documented. Examination of the growth rings will evidence distinctive patterns of growth ring thickness that reflect a tree's response to annual variations in precipitation and temperature. Very dry years will produce thin rings. Wet years will result in more robust growth and wider rings. These pattern sequences of thin and thick rings reflect regional climate trends. A group of trees from the same general region and of the same age will all generally replicate the same pattern because they all grew under the same climatic conditions. A modern old growth sequence reflecting up to a few centuries of growth can be overlapped with sequences from historic structures or archaeological sites and can provide absolute chronometric dates for those historic and archaeological samples. The historic and archaeological samples can then, in turn, be used to sequence older samples from older buildings and sites back to the limits of organic preservation. Dendrochronology was pioneered in the American Southwest by Andrew Ellicott Douglas and Clark Whistler, and this was no accident. In general, the growth rings of trees from arid places demonstrate the most pronounced and obvious variability in response to available moisture. Arid climates also help to preserve wood and other organic material, sometimes for centuries. By the late 1920s, dendrochronology had been used to precisely date the occupation of many southwestern Pueblo sites, which contained preserved timbers that could be sampled. In 1937, Douglas established the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona. One of the most comprehensive collections of tree ring sequences in the world is still housed there. Dendrochronology in the eastern United States didn't become an established methodology until the 1970s, when the dendrochronology labs at Cornell and Columbia opened. Although successful attempts in the East date back to at least the 30s, the 1980s saw a large-scale and successful application of dendrochronology in colonial Williamsburg. And the early 2000s brought extensive dendrochronology projects to New England. In Pennsylvania, the method remains very rare. An extensive review of documented dendrochronological evaluations of structures in the eastern states cited only 21 Pennsylvania examples, about 4% of the total documented structures. Very recently, biologists and foresters have been using dendrochronology to reconstruct climatic variability and fire history in the eastern US, specifically in Pennsylvania. While their research generally has not involved collaborations with historians and archaeologists or cited the available literature in those disciplines, they have made some inferences about the roles that historic and pre-contact land use may have played in the evolution of forest communities. The major constraints to the widespread use and utility of dendrochronology in the East are climate-related and are also a product of land use history. Since precipitation is substantial and regular in the East and wood preservation is not ideal, almost all applications of the method in the East have been for standing structures. Its potential for environmental reconstruction was recognized by Eastern archaeologists in the 1980s, but application to Native American archaeology in the East remains uncommon. There have been a few successful attempts with well-preserved native dugout canoes, but these are as rare as the preserved vessels themselves. A second climate-related constraint is the difficulty of building reliable sequences in a region with plentiful water and rare droughts. Trees growing close to streams show very little variability in ring thickness. So only upland trees that rely entirely on rainfall for their water yield usable sequences. As there can be substantial differences in precipitation between physiographic provinces in the East, and even between adjacent watersheds at times, many samples are required to build reliable sequences. Finally, almost all eastern forests were harvested for timber, fuel, or bark in the mid to late 19th and early 20th centuries. Living old growth trees in the East are very rare, and as are the long sequences those trees can yield. Despite the limitations, dendrochronology holds substantial promise for the reconstruction of both land use history and for the effects that land use had on regional and local forests and ecosystems in the East and in Pennsylvania specifically. Any successful dendrochronological assay minimally provides two very useful pieces of information. The first is a specific chronometric date for the felling of the tree that produced the subject sample. The second is the identification of the genus and species of the tree that produced the subject sample. In some cases, a dendrochronological assay can also provide the age of the harvested timber if both the initial and the last growth ring are included in the sample, or can be estimated based on the preserved rings that are assayed. When this information is examined in the context of documented land use history within the region or locality that produced it, a snapshot emerges of some of the constituents of local forest communities at a very specific point in time. Additional context gleaned from palynology, witness tree inventories, or archaeological wood charcoal and macrobotanical identification can bring that snapshot into very sharp focus. Certainly, data from dendrochronological studies are not very likely to represent a random sample of tree species from a forest community. The choice of wood species in the construction of a historic cabin or outbuilding reflects the preferences of the builder, but they also reflect what was available to that builder. In an era when logs moved mostly by animal or human power, the timbers of an old cabin, barn, or mill reflect the species present in local forests. In turn, those local forests reflect the climate, soil, moisture, successional stage, and anthropogenic conditions that surround them. Tree species of any forest community in temperate Appalachia always reflect the age of that community. All localities move through a succession of dominant species as the landscape matures, and each habitat type, defined by slope, soil type, solar aspect, and available moisture, has its own community of successional species. Following a natural or anthropogenic event that denudes a particular locality, for example, a flood, a fire, timbering, regrowth begins with annual weeds and grasses. After this stage, vegetation proceeds through a variety of woody and tree species until, over the course of a century or more, the climax community is reached in a specific habitat type. For example, a recently burned or logged foot slope in a hollow might progress from weeds and grasses to woody shrubs to a forest dominated by fast-growing, light-adapted species like birch, black locust, cherry, and white pine. These, in turn, are succeeded by slower-growing deciduous species such as tulip poplar, basswood, chestnut, hickory, and oak. The growing canopy, if left undisturbed, will eventually shade the forest floor, allowing for the growth and domination of the forest community by hemlock, which can flourish in low light conditions. This successional progression presents a variety of building timbers for historic populations, depending on the age and habitat type of the forest community they are exploiting. That information, in turn, tells us something about the successional stages of local forests at specific points in time, and by inference, the effect human land use may have been having on them. What follows are summaries of several Pennsylvania and Middle Atlantic examples of dendrochronological projects with their historic contexts. The pictures that these examples provide us of local forest communities at specific points in time can help to reconstruct the effects that pre-contact and historic land use and industries had on the ecological communities of the region. They are valuable data sets for archaeologists, historians, foresters, and biologists, and they have a role to play in planning for and adapting to anthropogenic change in the future. So I'm going to hand this off now to Kate and let her proceed with project examples.
All right, so the first example that we'll look at is the work and research of Dr. Kristen K. DeGraw. Her two most recent publications are a discussion of the preservation of ecological data in historic log buildings and an analysis of whether reforestation evidence following indigenous depopulation is found in historic log buildings. 11 projects are featured on her website that showcase some of her past work through her tree ring dating laboratory. These select projects are all located in West Virginia or Virginia. The samples come from log homes, barns, and a fort, Fort Ashby. All the examples list the species sampled, the number of samples, and the inferred construction date. The majority of buildings were constructed of white oak, with tulip poplar and American chestnut sometimes used with the oak. DeGraw and Hessel collected and analyzed over 300 timber samples from the historic buildings and over 100 samples from old-growth forests in the central Appalachian Mountains of the eastern United States. DeGraw's 2017 research indicated that historic log buildings in central Appalachia were constructed with locally available materials, and that as building location and local forest ecology changed, so did the chosen construction materials. In general, DeGraw noticed the trend that older buildings were constructed of white oak, while younger buildings were constructed of mixed white oak, tulip poplar, white pine, and American chestnut. Results of the study supported the conclusion that reforestation did occur in upland forests after depopulation, and that both indigenous land use practices and environmental factors would have produced the forest communities present upon European settlement. Both studies suggest that European builders in the Appalachian region would have encountered forests already altered by indigenous land use practices, and that at least in part, construction materials were chosen by local availability. The second example is drawn from the lead author's thesis research completed in 2017. The subject of the research is referred to as the Carroll Cabin because of its prolonged occupation by the Carroll family and their descendants. Although the name infers a cabin, which is a log home with unsquared timbers, the Carroll Cabin is a vernacular-style squared log home with a northern frame addition that includes a large sandstone chimney constructed off of the log home's north gable end. The property is located in Fayette County. Previous DCNR-initiated research included a review of the township warranty map and a brief architectural analysis. This preliminary data suggested that the Carroll Cabin was no older than about 1830, based primarily on the visible architectural hardware. During the thesis research, 5 methodologies were used to best understand the history of the home and the surrounding landscape, and these included historic documents research, archaeological investigation, dendrochronology, soil chemistry analysis, and architectural survey. Each methodology provided a unique set of data requiring critical analysis. For example, historic documents retain the biases of their authors. Squared logs can lose the outermost rings that most precisely date the timber. Homes can be renovated and partially or wholly rebuilt over time. Still, when taken together, the data showed that the Carroll Cabin was older than initially thought. The chain of title establishing the recorded history of the home is either complete or nearly so, depending on the potential connection between Dr. Robert Johnson and Thomas Ramsey, which could indicate that the chain is complete. In August and September of 2016, Forbes State Forest assisted with the collection of 13 wood samples from the house and nearby trees, 10 of which were sent to the Cornell Tree Ring Laboratory for analysis and reporting. 2 of the samples, from trees growing adjacent to the house, were maple. All house timbers were white oak, all those that were sampled. The lack of local oak chronologies, though, and the limited number of samples from the home, 5 instead of at least 10 or more, proved challenging. Oak chronologies from Cook Forest, Dysart Forest, and Stebbins Gulch were used to date the Carroll Cabin samples, and researchers determined that the log house was built circa 1775 with a repair date of circa 1810. The dendrochronology results showed that historic documents and 2 architectural analyses alone could not accurately date the home's approximate construction date. Thomas Ramsey could have been living on his property prior to official ownership and may have reused an 18th century home and added newer material to potentially expand and/or improve upon the home. In this example, dendrochronology provided key data to understanding the Carroll Cabin's age and that white oak was growing locally and used for all of the assayed timbers. The third example is part of a Pennsylvania Department of Transportation bridge project in Jim Thorpe, Carbon County. During a bike or pedestrian bridge project, part of the Delaware and Lehigh Canal Lock H cribbing system was uncovered, as documented by cultural resource professional Kevin Mock. The origins of the canal system date to the early 19th century. 10 timbers 10 timber cross sections were cut and sent to the Cornell Tree Ring Laboratory for identification and analysis. 9 of those were eastern hemlock and 1 was red pine. When compared, the timbers cross-dated and could be combined into 4 distinct chronologies that you see there on the slide. Since these timbers cross-dated so well and could be, quote, compared to regional and site hemlock chronologies from forests and historic buildings around New York State and Pennsylvania, end quote, 4 felling dates were easily distinguishable: 1834, 1840, 1844, and 1852 to 1853. The pine sample was degraded and missing an unknown quantity of rings, therefore it was difficult to determine an accurate fell date. Griggs proposed that the existing outer 1802 tree ring date and the different tree species could indicate, quote, that it was part of an earlier structure, perhaps the earliest cribbing at the time the lock was built, but this is just a tentative suggestion and cannot be proven by this sample, end quote. One conclusion of this data is that the red pine sample was part of the earliest cribbing system, which received maintenance at 4 later times in the 19th century. In terms of broader land use and landscape, the 1834, 1844, and 1852 to 53 sample groups cross-dated with forest and historic building chronologies from Pennsylvania, upstate New York, and with site chronologies along the canal systems and eastern Lake Ontario. The source location of those timbers cannot easily be determined, but the data suggests that trade networks across the northeastern United States were carrying hemlock and red pine timbers, whether they were sourced closer to Pennsylvania or from more distant locations across the network. The 1840 sample group, however, most closely matched hemlocks that grow in central Pennsylvania. While we do not know all of the factors that contributed to this local choice, we do know that climax hemlock forests were present and being harvested in central Pennsylvania for such transportation projects in the mid-19th century. The fourth is another example of PennDOT finding and analyzing preserved wood to better understand and interpret industrial and archaeological history in Pennsylvania. The Salina Bridge project, located along the Kiskiminetas River in Westmoreland and Armstrong counties, is an ongoing bridge replacement project for the 1906 3-span pin and eye-bar Parker through truss structure that began in the fall of 2015. Research and archaeological data document pre-contact occupation and travel throughout the region, though heavy commercial and industrial development within the project area has likely destroyed any intact evidence. The Salina Bridge crosses not only the Kiskiminetas River, but also saltworks, the western division of the Mainline Canal, the Cure Brick Factory, and the Western Pennsylvania Railroad. A pedestrian reconnaissance was completed as part of the project and involved geomorphic investigations on the north bank of the river and just south of the bridge's stone abutments in an outwash area. The canal's towpath was visible in this area and was chosen for a geomorphic trench. 14 stratigraphic horizons were recorded within the trench, many of which indicated alluvial deposits from flooding. Recovered from the surface, the interface of strata 9 and 10 were 6 wooden brick pavers, with creosote or macadam adhered to the undersurfaces, 5 of which were sent to the Cornell Tree Ring Laboratory for species and fell date analyses. Research indicated that wooden blocks were used for paving as early as the 1820s in the eastern United States cities. However, the creosote treatment was not utilized until the 1870s. The inverted position of the wooden pavers was interpreted as the result of catastrophic flooding that brought and deposited debris downriver or from road improvements in nearby logland town, Laurel Hill, from about 1840 to 1878. Dendrochronological analysis of the wooden pavers is currently incomplete, given the restrictions in place during the COVID-19 pandemic. Once the dates are received, PennDOT archaeologists will be able to assess what event caused the pavers' deposition and allow for a more complete view of the effects of major flooding and land use and change resulting from continued riverside development. The identification of the genera and species used to manufacture the pavers will provide useful information about the late 19th century forest communities exploited to produce the pavers. A fifth example comes from a hand-hewn window sill timber recovered from Camp Michaud on Michaud State Forest in Cumberland County. Camp Michaud is a complex historic property and archaeological site that includes a late 18th century farmstead that eventually became a company farm, known as Bunker Hill Farm, for the nearby Pine Grove Iron Furnace, circa 1770 to 1895. Later, the property became one of Pennsylvania's first two civilian conservation corps camps from 1933 to 1940, and then a POW camp for high-value German and Japanese prisoners during the Second World War. The last historic use of the site was a Presbyterian and United Church of Christ church camp from 1947 to the final dismantlement of the camp buildings in 1975. One of the few preserved above-ground elements of the Bunker Hill Farm is the gable end wall of a large stone barn. After the unfortunate storm-related collapse of the barn wall in 2016, State Forest staff recovered the timber and placed it inside a climate-controlled office building to deter further deterioration. The barn's exact construction date is unknown, but two possibilities are: 1, the barn was part of the late 18th century privately owned farm, or 2, that the barn was constructed as part of the later company farm, or Bunker Hill. Though the timber was hand-hewn, it is possible that it is not the original sill. The timber was sent to the Cornell Tree Ring Laboratory in early January 2020 for species identification and analysis. The final analysis and reporting are not complete, but personal communication from Carol Griggs of the Cornell Tree Ring Laboratory has provided some information. The timber is pitch pine, for which there are few reference chronologies. An additional challenge was the missing and damaged, and thus immeasurable, rings. However, since oak trees show similar responses to available moisture in ring development, and since oak sequences are available for the region, Griggs determined that the outermost measurable ring dated to 1818, and that the tree was likely felled circa 1825. Based on communication with District Forester Roy Brubaker, the timber dates to the era of peak charcoal production at Pine Grove Furnace. Studies of pre- and post-European settlement and forest fire data in the region indicate, quote, there were likely widespread forest fires on roughly a 25-year interval pre-European settlement era, and likely increasing to every 10 to 15 years post-European settlement, end quote. Forest fires would encourage the growth of, quote, conifers like pitch pine that both resprout after a fire and have improved germination and seeding competitiveness following fire. Brubaker's assessment is that pitch pine was not good for making charcoal and might have been the only option for building materials. It may also have been an intentional choice, since pitch pine was widely used in the 19th century and earlier for flooring, sills, window and door frames, structural beams, and a variety of outdoor applications due to its high resin content and decay resistance. This information suggests that the timber was either a replacement sill for the barn, or that the barn was constructed circa 1825. Regardless, it indicates that the local landscape circa 1825 reflected the contemporaneous logging and burning activities associated with operating Pine Grove Furnace. The use of available pitch pine as an architectural material also indicates that the builder likely had local pitch pine available for the sill. In particular, this example shows the value of combining dendrochronological data with landscape analysis to determine pre-contact and historic land use and what factors might have influenced its use and development. A recent publication in the Journal of Forest Ecology and Management details an effort to document the historic occurrence of fires and their effect on several species of hard pines in Pennsylvania. The research was conducted by taking cross-sections, or cookies, from preserved stumps in the 12 studied locations in Pennsylvania forests, subjecting them to dendrochronological assay, and counting and recording visible fire scars. The researchers, foresters, and forest ecologists focused on understanding the relationship between fire incidents and the regeneration of stands of pitch pine, red pine, and table mountain pine in the Commonwealth. While the research focus was silvicultural, the data includes some important historical observations on fire and land use in the 16th to 20th centuries in Pennsylvania. The most important conclusions of their data analysis are as follows, and this is a quote from their research. For all tree species, pith calendar years ranged from 1530 to 1932, with an average year of 1711. For all species, 71% of the regeneration occurred prior to 1754, the earliest dates of Euro-American settlement, and 8% occurred in the decades following the beginning of expansive industrialized logging, circa 1850. Frequency of pitch and red pine regeneration was negatively skewed towards earlier years, with a mode of 1668 and 1614 respectively, while the frequency of TMP and mixed pines were positively skewed towards normal. For all species, an abrupt increase in regeneration appeared to occur at approximately 1580 to 1600. From the years 1600 to 1900, regeneration was lowest in the decades of 1780, 1790, 1850, 1870, and 1880. So this data documents evidence for regular and likely anthropogenic fires prior to the mid-18th century in the habitats and landforms where hard pine species grow. In the Middle Atlantic, those habitats are typically dry and well-drained areas with sandy or coarse soils. Precisely why Aboriginal populations may have been burning these habitats is open to question, but native use of fire to manipulate habitat is well documented in Pennsylvania and throughout North America. It is unlikely that hard pine habitats were burned for horticultural activities, so burning to encourage the growth of young vegetation as browsing habitat for ungulate game species is more likely. There may be a link between this apparent habitat management and the contemporaneous specifics of culture change in Native American societies. Contact with Europeans caused expansive and rapid change in North American societies throughout the region from the 16th to the mid-18th centuries. Native lifeways changed with the effects of epidemic diseases, the economics, politics, and shifting alliances of the fur trade, and in the 17th and 18th centuries, expanding colonization. It could be that regular burning of some habitats was also a product of this large-scale change in Native societies. Conversely, it may also be a practice that predates the contact period and extends well back into pre-contact times. Good data on Native manipulation of forest communities before the 16th century is currently very rare, but gathering that data would be key to understanding how and when Eastern forest communities began to respond to anthropogenic influences, and also to defining the origins of what ecologists and geographers term the Anthropocene epoch that they posit follows the Holocene in Eastern North America. In summary, the example projects reviewed by the authors provide some information about the interactions that historic Euro-American and Native American populations had with the forest communities of Pennsylvania, and some information about the age and composition of those forest communities at various points in time. They also point the way towards future lines of inquiry and collaborative research. The oldest data that was reviewed came from a silvicultural study of fire incidents in hard pine stumps. Those data range chronologically from the 16th to the 19th centuries. Given that the study was focused on 3 species of pine in very specialized habitats, inferences about the range and evolution of regional forest types over time are not possible. Despite that limitation, the data certainly support the inference that Native people were likely intentionally burning this habitat regularly throughout the contact period, and that this burning began to decrease as colonial Euro-American populations began to settle the region. Structural data from the 18th century all document extensive use of local forests in the early and middle stages of succession. The extensive use of oak is a marker of habitats that are open enough to allow sufficient light for those species. Somewhat later exploitation of species like tulip poplar, white pine, and chestnut suggest a focus on forests that were in even earlier and more open stages of succession, presumably after early colonial land clearing. Data from the 19th century mostly document industrial structures and interaction with local forests. These uses focused on climax species like hemlock for the first time, and tree ring sequences used in the dendrochronological assays indicate that those climax stands were likely local to the locations where they were used. That is, they were at least stands of there were at least stands of very old shade-tolerant trees in harvestable numbers in places like the Lehigh Valley during the era of canal building, about the 1820s to the 1840s, as well as stands of hard pine species. Archival records of the canal companies operating Pennsylvania actually had design criteria that specified hemlock and hard pine for the specific applications, and the preferred use of pitch pine for exposed doors and sills was also a feature of regional structures in the 19th century. This may indicate increasing specificity of and preference for certain materials in these industrial structures and in domestic structures as well. It likely reflects accumulating knowledge, understanding of material properties, and increasing standardization as the industrial age evolved. Demand for specific wood types undoubtedly played a significant role in the rapid and extensive timber extraction unleashed on eastern forests in the 19th century. Joe, would you like to take the discussion?
I would, and I even remember to unmute. I'm going to try leaving my glasses on and see what happens. An obvious feature of the data from 18th century structures is the extensive use of oak in the oldest structures. Oaks are not tolerant of low light conditions, and forests dominated by oaks are in the young to middle stages of succession. The builders of these structures found themselves in a relatively young and likely open forest, as reflected in their choices of materials. It has been known for a long time, primarily through paleontological, witness tree, and dendrochronological / fire incidence data, that Eastern North America forests were not endless, dark, closed canopy climax forests prior to European colonization. They were instead a mosaic of forest communities of various ages that were the result of frequent and regular natural and anthropogenic removal of trees and undergrowth. Silvicultural and forest ecology research in Western Europe has strongly suggested that very open stands of oak and thorny brushland were common in post-Pleistocene Europe and possibly in Eastern North America prior to the high-intensity land use occasioned by agriculture and resource extraction. A Dutch researcher named Vera postulated that this open forest community was the result of intensive grazing by wild ungulates. Vera did not consider that pre-agricultural human land use and interactions with these wild grazing populations may have also been a driving influence behind the establishment of these open forests. Research in the Northern Rockies indicates that Aboriginal populations in that region frequently burn certain forest communities in part to produce favorable browse for wild ungulates and concentrated these game animals in predictable places. Similar things may have been going on in eastern forests as well. Indeed, the Jamestown colonists noted extensive Native American burning of the forest on the Virginia coast for unknown reasons within 2 days of sighting land in 1607. This anthropogenic manipulation of forest communities and the grazing animals that live in them would likely have produced younger and more open forest communities through a combination of both burning and browsing by deer and elk populations attracted by the younger growth in the burned areas. It's also worth noting that this anthropogenic manipulation of the forest and its resident ungulates can perhaps be regarded as an early step in a process that eventually leads to domesticated ungulates like sheep, cattle, horses, goats, and reindeer in Europe and other parts of the world. The best evidence suggests that pre-contact Pennsylvania forests were not, quote, natural, but in fact were largely managed landscapes. Humans have been here for millennia, and we have always interacted in substantial and intentional ways with the environmental communities around us. The reconstruction of forest history is obviously a rich and important area of research with profound implication for land managers, forest ecologists, foresters and silviculturalists, biologists, archaeologists, and historians. It is also a research focus that demands interdisciplinary approaches. The cultural resource professionals are not trained to really see the forests or the trees. The biological communities are not trained to see the role of people in the forests. To that end, we have several suggestions. First, the attempt to synthesize and reevaluate existing data from dendrochronological assays should continue with input from both communities. There is a body of unpublished or difficult to access Pennsylvania data from both the Columbia and Cornell dendrochronology labs that could be gathered and evaluated. And this would certainly contribute to the research begun with this paper. Second, the archaeological community routinely collects wood charcoal from pre-contact features for radiocarbon assay. Those assays provide chronometric dates for the features that produce them, and by extension, for the sites where the features were found. Very rarely, if ever, is any of this charcoal subjected to microscopic analysis and identification. Doing so with a sample of wood charcoal would produce a sample of the tree species that the site residents were surrounded by, and the radiocarbon assay would provide a date for that sample. This would have the potential to reconstruct a deep forest community history that spanned millennia. Third, palynological data are gathered and used by both communities, and an interdisciplinary synthesis and analysis of the available data from Pennsylvania, both by region and by chronology, would be of great utility to all. Preserved pollen samples with stratigraphic and chronological context provide a picture of all wind-pollinated plants in the sample locality, and by extension, major components of the local forest communities at specific points in time. Finally, all three of these synthetic studies would be well suited to an agency-university partnership approach to encourage academic and graduate student research and multidisciplinary input across departments and between universities and land management agencies. I'm going to hand this last paragraph back to you, Kate, because this is, I think, our most important conclusion.
Okay. As a final recommendation, it is worth noting that dendrochronological sampling is impossible in the absence of preserved historic structures. Charcoal identification from pre-contact sites requires preserved archaeological contexts. Palynological samples come from preserved and undisturbed wetlands or from consistently dry environments like rock shelters. Preservation and careful resource stewardship lie at the heart of valuable interdisciplinary research. As DCNR and USFS land managers face the challenges of multi-use mandates in the context of climate change, increasingly intensive recreational use, and demands for resource extraction, much of the data they need to make good decisions lies preserved in historic structures and sealed in archaeological deposits beneath their feet. The preservation and stewardship of the data that should be prioritized in public land use planning and practice. Without it, we will face a fraught and challenging future without the critical lessons that the past can teach us. Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm assuming Mindy's coming back in here, and I am going to unshare this PowerPoint so I can perhaps see the questions.
Thank you very much, Kate and Joe. That was really fascinating. We were just having a sort of side conversation regarding, your premise that these weren't really natural forests; they were managed early. Can you talk a little more about that? Because I think, our image is, well, it just used to be a lot of natural forest, and then we came in and started taking it down.
Kate, can I butt into this one?
Sure.
Just to say, Mindy, that don't you think that depends on what the word natural means?
Fair enough.
I have a recollection from a U.S. Forest Service regional archaeologist meeting in Missoula that I attended in the 1980s. And there was a presentation by a couple of folks from the recreation and trails programs who talked about management inside the wilderness areas in the Northern Rockies. And pronounced that they wanted to pull down all of the historic cabins that were still standing inside the wilderness areas because they wanted to remove all sign of human land use and restore it to a natural or wild environment. And one of my colleagues stood up and said, "Geez, doesn't that depend on whether or not you consider Native American people to be humans? Because their stuff is everywhere inside these wilderness areas." I think as long as there's been the data that's available now would suggest that as long as our species has been present in any setting, we have been messing around with the environment. So I think our idea of what is, quote, wild and what isn't needs to be conditioned by that.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Jeff Marshall. How confident can we be in using dendroid in southeastern Pennsylvania to date log structures that presumably date to late 18th, early 19th century?
Kate?
I mean, I would say, depending on how many samples you have, if you have enough to create a good enough average date for your building, which the going recommendation is at least 10 or more. The more you have, the better you can cross date the timbers in that one building, let alone, be able to compare it to other chronologies available in that region. But I would think we have a pretty good library and data set so far. And if the chronologies are available, then you should be able to pretty confidently cross date that information.
Okay, thank you. So I do want to ask a sort of a leading question because, you've been talking a lot about log buildings, and a lot of log buildings are located in state parks. And, we know that people don't really think of DCNR as a historic preservation agency because they are dealing with lots of historic structures, lots and lots of them. So I know that there was some talk of a historic preservation program or position at DCNR, and the pandemic hit. So I wondered if you could give us an update on that.
Yeah, I can. As you know, I was working with those guys right up until the big layoff. And I continue to work with them. I'm just not getting paid right now. But there's a bunch of plans on the table. The agency, just to back up for a minute, DCNR DCNR is the largest landowner in Pennsylvania. DCNR manages something like 2.5 million acres of land. And on that 2.5 million acres of land, which, by the way, is mostly state forest, not state parks, there are an unknown number of historic structures of various kinds, and also unknown and not terribly well documented number of archaeological sites. DCNR is well aware of this. They have been in discussions with SHPO for years now about this situation. They do not have any historic preservation staff. They don't really have a historic preservation program. So in that context, I was brought on to help them try to get the plane off the ground. And there's a bunch of very solid plans in place, a position for what would be the equivalent at the federal level of a preservation officer for the agency was advertised, and people were interviewed. A really good candidate was selected. COVID came down, everything froze, and nothing has thawed out since. So everything's in stasis. But in my opinion, the agency's trying to move in the right direction, and they're still pounding on the governor's office to try to get this position unfrozen. And we will see what happens.
Right. Okay. So you expect that it hasn't been abandoned. It's still in the books and in the plans.
I know that it has not been abandoned.
Great, great. And so, okay, we have a question from an anonymous attendee. Were the European traditions of the timber building conversant with using white oak, or were there other traditions?
What do you think about that, Kate?
I'm not really sure. It'd probably depend on, the knowledge of maybe the best building material per region, maybe not specifically devoted to one particular tree species, but maybe as you move to a different area, what most closely represents the material you're used to working with.
I mean, the little bit that I know about it from Europe, or a lot of log buildings in Northern Europe are actually made out of softer wood, like spruce. And so I'm kind of with Kate on this. I think, they brought the building tradition with them to North America, but they used whatever they found and whatever seemed suitable in the environment that they found themselves in.
I'll say for the Carroll cabin, if you, like when I was doing the architectural analysis, there's actually a hole that had been there that you can look up through and see the central beam of the roof and then the rafters coming down, and you can actually see, I'm not sure how old those timbers are. I mean, I wasn't able to access those, but they had Roman numerals to, plan out how to connect all of the roof joints and the beams, and that's a European technology that is very clearly preserved on those beams. So we know at least the technology is the same as people came around and built their homes or had other people come and build homes for them. And my assumption is that they just, had knowledge of what the best material was, or could go to a new location and find the best material for the technology that they knew how to use, the methods.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm switching back and forth between Attendify and Zoom to get all these questions. So in what period does lumber timber become a commodity sourced from afar and shipped versus locally sourced?
You want me to take a swing at that?
Yeah, I'm not really sure.
I think you start seeing shipped lumber and timbers pretty early on in the canal era. I mean, it's mostly a transportation thing. Figuring that out is mostly a transportation thing. So by the time you see transportation via canal, I think you're probably going to see people beginning to ship boards and timbers. And that picks up obviously when the railroads are constructed later in the 19th century. But that said, local timber mills persist. I mean, here in Pennsylvania, local timber mills persist, to this day. So, I think especially in rural places, it was always a mix, but, I think people are using locally available stuff right up into the 20th century for sure. I think in industrial applications and Kate, I'm thinking here of the canal timbers and the stuff from the bridge. I think those things might reflect timber that's not maybe harvested locally. I think when you're talking about industrial stuff, I think you probably are looking at stuff that maybe isn't necessarily from that place. Although that wasn't entirely true at that canal lock, right?
Yeah, they're a mix of local and broader network boards.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Christine asks a question. She says she hopes it's not confusing. I see it might actually be a little political. How does the government use the studies, and how can we rely on the government to preserve the historic significant findings? What about studies done on private properties by developers who have their own people do the research? I don't mean political as in the president. I mean political as in whether or not you think the government uses studies in a correct way.
Most of our data from the example projects that we did, which ones are from public property, Kate? It's Carroll Cabin and Michaud Barn, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the ones in Virginia and West Virginia, are they mostly private?
Those are
Or?
mostly private. Yeah, those are mostly people seeking her out. I think following her dissertation research, where she probably requested access. But now it seems like she's more of like a for hire commodity, either for personal projects, or for research.
I mean, I can tell you that at Carroll Cabin and at Camp Michaud, which are both DCNR owned properties, publicly owned properties, the people that are managing those properties and managing the forests around them are really interested in this data, primarily because they want to use the data to help preserve and manage the properties. I mean, and I have firsthand knowledge of that, and so does Kate. I think to the broader topic of how does government use historic preservation and archaeological data, I think it's a pretty big nut to crack. And I worked in cultural resource management for 40 years, and I'm still working in it. And I have seen the full range of use and non-use of the data. I have seen the best and worst of what it can do, and I don't expect that to ever change.
Shelby offered a comment about using Dendro on a few state historic sites, maybe Ephrata and Conrad Weiser back in the late 1990s and early 2000s. We used the Columbia Lab, and the results were used extensively to date, interpret, and then manage the buildings.
And I am aware of those data, but I could not get my hands on them. That stuff is not published. It's in the hands of PHMC, and that data is very hard to get.
Well, I think that's also certainly an issue with archaeological studies that are done so developers can get permission to destroy the site. I mean, we've all had experiences where, the information is a little suspect because they didn't find anything. And you wonder if that's true or not. So I think it's definitely a concern that, the work should be made available so we can learn from it. I wanted to go back to your sort of call to action to continue the study and to look for some kind of an agency university lead. Like, how can we make that happen? Like, how does, do you have ideas for how that can move ahead? I'm sure you do.
Kate, you want to talk about how IUP's gotten involved in some of this stuff?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was gonna say the thesis topic on the Carroll Cabin that I had, one of the rangers from Forbes State Forest reached out to the department at IUP, to the anthropology department, and he was actively trying to seek out, students who would be willing to research, or whether the department would be willing to research several of the historic properties. And there was a number of staff, from the forests that had already started historic research. I mean, they have some information gathered for several of the properties that they own. So it's not like they weren't doing anything. But I think there was a recognition of, in order to keep moving things forward, to reach out to an agency and people who need to do research to continue, things that they didn't necessarily have time to do. So the ranger had reached out to the department chair at the time and was like, hey, we have these 5 buildings, or these 5 sites. Would anybody be interested in them? And then looking at what fits with your requirements, maybe what you're able to do, and how that fits in with giving them what they need. So the partnership, at least for the Carroll Cabin and for, I think, at least 1 or 2 other sites at that time, really worked out well for master's thesis research. And, that partnership, and then all the other people that became involved, at least in my research, the former owners, they had that contact information, and I was able to reach out with them. Their interests, local interests, just really worked out fantastic for building a good thesis, giving DCNR context of what they owned. And you have maybe access to more knowledge of data sources that can really help to build a well-rounded report for them.
And I think in a broader perspective too, I think building a sort of advisory group of faculty members from the appropriate departments in Pennsylvania, and linking those people with some really critical folks. I mean, since we've been talking about DCNR, at DCNR, who are interested in getting the research done is critical. Now, DCNR has done this to some extent with natural resource departments through a program called Think Outside. And they have even included a few sort of preservation and archaeology projects in the list of projects they developed for this Think Outside initiative. But again, because they don't have anybody on the staff at DCNR who can, who knows anything about preservation or archaeology, it's difficult to pull that part of the partnership together. But that's the model that I think would work.
And also you mentioned about bringing in biologists. So you need to get two departments at a university to be tuned into this, right? Because that's still a little bit of silo, one department from another. So, okay. Well, we are out of time and I don't have any other pending questions. There's a few comments in the chat box that people are sharing about past research, but thank you so much, Joe and Kate, for giving us your great work. As I said, very interesting and something you know me, I say I don't know anything about archaeology, but I'm continually surprised by, how broad reaching the field is. And I would have never thought really of dendrochronology so much in this way.
Cool.
So thank you for sharing.
We hope to get it published in the next year or so. So look for it in print.
Great. And now, so Kate, you're going to change clothes, put on a yellow vest and head back out.
Back to my field clothes, back to excavation. Yes.
Go get them.
All right. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks, guys.
All right.
Bye-bye.
All right. We have a session at 12 o'clock with Matthew Craig, who's going to talk about the recently listed 11 most endangered list, the Negro Opera House in Pittsburgh. So hope to see some of you there.